about race and racism. Tonight is the inaugural event of this year of very active listening, our YoVAL. Ora Weinbach and I, as co-chairs, are so grateful for the leadership of Rabbi Levine and the extraordinary efforts and expertise of the planning committee. Creating this program required a commitment to the ideals and the values that undergird it, as well as the imagination and ability to bring it to fruition. It has been an inspiring experience to work on this together with all of you. Our sincere thanks as well go to the host committee and of course to our generous sponsors. But the real fulfillment of the goals of this YoVAL depend on all of us to bring open minds, open hearts, and open ears to listen and to learn about others in our community and in our neighborhood, to learn about their history and their experiences, and also how that intersects with ours. Sadly, this is not a new topic. It was one that was of concern to an earlier rabbi of the Jewish Center as well. During the turbulent 1960s, Rabbi Norman Lamb of blessed memory spoke multiple times about the evils of racism, the evils of economic injustice, and decried the complacency about these issues. Rabbi Lamb went on to say that Avraham responded to the trials he experienced in his generation, not by looking away, but by answering Hineni. And that is what we, in our generation, are doing here today. This year of very active listening is our congregational and our communal Hineni. So now Rabbi Levine will frame the project by exploring some of the most important Jewish values that animate how we are meant to respond to issues of race and racism. Following his talk, Ora will share an overview of the unique events that we have planned. Events that will bring us a fuller understanding of ourselves and our neighbors, people who we may or may not know, but who live right here in our community, even right here in our zip code of 10024 and in the adjacent zip codes. So we're looking forward to a very interesting and meaningful year together, and we hope that we'll share all the events with you. And now, Rabbi Levine, let's begin.
Thank you, Virginia, for your kind words, and thank you for your leadership on this important issue. I want to take a moment to thank our community educator, Ora Weinbach, for everything that she's contributed, and special thanks to the members of our outstanding planning committee and host committee, as well as our generous sponsors. You know, it's a source of great personal pride and communal pride that our shul has undertaken this project. Jewish Center has always taken leadership roles on the issues of the day. Refugees in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the Russian Jewry movement, supporting the state of Israel through times of crisis, the sustainability of Jewish education, and most recently, modeling for our community how to safely navigate this pandemic. But even as we're busy battling COVID, we're also duty-bound to create the time and the space to learn about and talk about the issues of race and racism in our country that have yet to be adequately addressed. Today, November 9th, is the anniversary of Kristallnacht. Along with shuls and Jewish institutions around the country and around the world, the Jewish Center will be leaving its lights on. It's a small gesture. The idea is to make a show of solidarity in our ongoing fight, not only against anti-Semitism, but against prejudice and intolerance more broadly. So allow me to make a few points of clarification before I begin. First, this project is not about anti-Semitism. The fact that we're talking about racism doesn't mean we believe anti-Semitism doesn't require our attention. It does. Focus on the universal doesn't come at the expense of the particular. I'm quite confident that it's possible to meaningfully address both, each on its own terms. Second, I want to point out that this project is not about politics. It's not about political activism. It's first and foremost about Jewish values. And finally, with respect to these issues, some have advanced the argument that our involvement should be motivated by a sense of pragmatism. We stand with the African American community when it faces the issue of racism. Its members will stand with us when we face the challenge of anti-Semitism. While there may or may not be merit to this argument, it's certainly not the driving force behind what it is that we're doing here. Our obligations at this time are founded in something much more basic and much more fundamental. I want to frame our conversation tonight. We'll just speak for maybe 20 minutes. I want to frame our conversation by asking three questions. Why are we stirred to respond? What does our Masorah say about racism? And as we head down this path, what are the Jewish values that should animate this conversation? On the first question, why are we stirred to respond? I want to share with you a commentary of the Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai. I have a great personal affinity for the Chida. My family in Israel is buried on Har Menuchos in Yerushalayim, and part of my experience of visiting Kivrei Avos is getting lost in the cemetery. It happens every time. When I get to the grave of the Chida, I know exactly where I am, and I can find my family. Chida was an amazing person. He led an extraordinary life. He traveled the world and wrote books about his experiences and the people and the places that he met along the way over the course of virtually the entire 18th century. He was also a brilliant scholar. And he says that he once found a manuscript of a medrash that had never seen the light of day. It was a medrash on a pasuk in Eov. The pasuk says, "Af lazos yecharad libi vayitar mimkomo." Eov says, I started to quake, I started to tremble, and the question is why? Why was Eov suddenly feeling afraid and suddenly feeling nervous? According to the medrash, it was reading about the death of Nadav and Avihu, our own sons, that made Eov so anxious. The question is, what's the meaning of this? Talmud tells us that when Paro took up the idea of killing Jewish children, he took counsel with three wise men, Bilam, Yisro, and Eov. Bilam was supportive, Yisro was opposed, and Eov was silent. It was when Eov learned the story of Nadav and Avihu that he began to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. And why were Nadav and Avihu killed? The Torah is ambiguous. The text is opaque. It doesn't really tell us. But the Medrash offers the following explanation. What was their great sin? What was their great misstep? Nadav tapped his brother on the shoulder and said, when are those two old guys, Moshe and Aaron, finally gonna leave this world so that you and I can take over the reins of leadership and lead the Jewish people into the next generation? They spoke out of turn and they were punished. What Eov noticed, the Chida writes, is that Nadav and Avihu were punished equally, even though it was all Nadav's wrongdoing. What did Avihu do? Amar Nadav le'Avihu. It was all Nadav's idea. Avihu said nothing. He didn't even respond. This is exactly the point. The problem was that Avihu remained silent. His passivity made him equally culpable. However noble his intentions, Eov recognized that his own silence was unforgivable. When we hear things or see things that run counter to the values of the Torah, we have to speak out, and we have to understand that the failure to speak out makes us complicit. The mitzvah of lo samud al dam reacha, the pasuk that tells us that we can't stand idly by the blood of our brother, isn't just about cases of life and death. Someone's drowning, you have to jump in and save them. It's also about cultivating a culture in which we stand up to redress the wrongs and injustices wherever we learn about them. In a slightly different context, I'll just share with you a comment of the Rambam when he writes about people who sit on the sideline. In temple times, whenever there was a calamity of any kind, whether national or regional, the Jewish people would quite literally take to the streets. It was a very elaborate procedure involving fast days and davening. The ark itself was brought out into the public square, began with the leadership, but everyone was called to participate. The Rambam writes the following, the very beginning of Hilchos Tainios. Aval im lo yizaku, v'lo yariu, ela yomer davar zeh, miminhag ha'olam ira lanu, v'tzara zu nikra nikres. If someone doesn't call out, if someone doesn't sound the alarm, if someone says, minhag ha'olam, it's the way of the world, this stuff happens, bad things happen. The Rambam says if someone responds that way, Harei zu derech achzarios, v'goremes lahem lidabek b'maaseim hara'im v'tosif atzara tzaros acheros. That is nothing less than cruelty. It's the opposite of the Jewish response. And such an attitude would lead not only to further bad acts, but it will cause more trouble for the world. Our country has been riven by issues of race and racism. Whether or not we have solutions or remedies, the one thing that our Masorah does not abide is silence in the face of sinfulness. We can't be bystanders. There's no seat on the sidelines for any of us. We have to take an active role, and in the first instance, that means actively listening and learning about the pressing issues of our moment. Let me turn now to the second issue that I want to address, the central issue of this evening's talk. What does our Masorah say about racism? The Ramchal very importantly writes in the beginning of Mesilas Yesharim in his introduction, he says, I'm not going to tell you anything that isn't already known to you. Ki lo simtza berov dvarai ela dvarim sherov bnei adam yodim osam v'lo mistak b'hem klal. Most of what I'm going to write in my book, people know it already. It's obvious to them. Ela shekfi rov pirsumam u'kineged ma shamitasam gluya lakol kach ela mehem matzui me'od b'shikcha rabba. But because those issues are so obvious, people don't pay attention to them. Certain values are so axiomatic that we never stop to spell them out. Precisely because we presume they're self-evident, we don't give them the attention they're due. So my intention tonight is simply to bring to the forefront of our consciousness that which we already know. And it begins with the supposition that any form of racism, prejudice, or discrimination is not only categorically wrong, it's abhorrent. There's no place for it. No place for it in our community, and it's incumbent upon us to develop a zero-tolerance policy for any kind of action or speech that demeans another human being. So allow me to share with you just 3 sources that I think should be on our minds as we think through these issues together. I'll start at the broadest level and then progressively drill down a little deeper. First source is a Rashi. Torah tells us, "Vayitzar Hashem Elokim es ha'adam afar min ha'adama, vayivpach be'apav nishmas chayim vahi adam lenefesh chayai." Man was created, the Torah tells us Hashem created him from the dust of the earth. So where did it come from? Where did Hashem get the dust? Rashi says, "Tzavar afaro mikol ha'adama me'arba ruchos." The dust was collected from all 4 corners of the earth. It's not just that the Torah values diversity. Rashi is telling us that diversity is inherent to the condition and makeup of humankind. Where there is no diversity, we get Migdal Bavel, and Hashem says that state of affairs is totally unacceptable. When Chazal say things like Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim shivim panim l'Torah shivim lashon shivim umos, these are all expressions of the deep value our tradition places on the notion of difference. Humankind was not created so that all people would look the same. Humankind was built on the foundation that each of us would be different from one another, and those differences would be a source of strength. Source number 1. Source number 2 is from a Mishnah. Why was man created as an individual? All the other creations in the world come up as species. And the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says, I'll tell you the answer. לפיכך נברא אדם יחידי ללמדך שכל המאבד נפש אחס מעלה עליו הכסוף כאילו איבד עולם מלא, וכל המקיים נפש אחס מעלה עליו הכסוף כאילו כי אין עולם מלא. Some version of the text, the Mishnah says, Achas mi Yisrael. Both are true. It doesn't matter. To take any life is to destroy an entire world, and to save any life is to save an entire world. We know the Mishnah well. But the Mishnah goes on. There's another reason that man was created as a singular being. Umipnei shalom habrios, shelo yomar adam lechavero, abba gadol me'avicha. That man was created alone forestalls the possibility of anyone ever saying, my father was greater than your father. Built into the system is a safeguard to protect us against any ideology that would suppose that one person or any type of person could ever be considered superior to any other. A racist belief is also a heretical belief and a form of blasphemy. But it goes even deeper, which leads us to the most elemental source. We know intuitively that our opposition to racism is rooted in the sense that every person is created b'tselem Elokim, and that a shared sense of humanity binds all human beings. What is tselem Elokim? What does it mean to be created in the image of the divine? Our Masorah has dozens of answers to that question. But whatever it means, whatever makes human beings separate and elevated and unique applies equally to all people. I want to share with you an insight based on a teaching of Rav Rosenzweig that I find particularly compelling. The notion of Tselem Elokim really comes up twice in the Torah. The first is in the first chapter of Bereshis. The Torah tells us, Vayomer Elokim naseh Adam mitzalmenu kidmusenu v'yirdu b'gas hayam u'va'of hashamayim u'va'bima v'chol ha'aretz v'chol ha'remes ha'romes al ha'aretz. Hashem said, let's make man in our image, and we'll give him dominion over the fish and over the fowl and over the cattle and over the earth and all the creeping animals on the earth. And then the Torah says, Hashem went ahead and did it. Masculine, feminine. Hashem created a human being who was created in his image. But then we have it a second time. The Torah tells us that the notion of Tselem Elokim didn't end in chapter 1. The Torah comes back to it in the aftermath of the flood. In Parak Tes, the Torah tells us Hashem spoke to Noach and he said, there's a new world order. Shofech dam adam b'adam damo yishafech ki b'tselem Elokim asa es ha'adam. If a person sheds blood, his blood will be shed because man was created in the image of God. But we know man was created in the image of God. The Torah told us this right at the beginning of the creation story. Why is this repeated now? And to this, I'll add a second question. Rabbi Akiva used to say, Hu haya omer chaviv adam shenivra b'tselem chiba yisera nodaslo shenivra b'tselem shenemar b'tselem lokim asa es ha'adam. Rabbi Akiva used to teach the Mishnah in Avos, beloved is man for he was created in God's image, but he's doubly beloved because God told man that he was created in God's image. And what's the proof text? What's the pasuk that Rabbi Akiva quotes? Not the pasuk from Bereshis, the pasuk from Noach. Why not quote the original pasuk? Why quote the pasuk in the aftermath of the flood? The answer is very telling. In its first iteration, when the idea was about man's sovereignty, Vayirdu, the notion that man would somehow be a sovereign over the other creations in the world, when his uniqueness was tied to the idea that he would rule over the other creations, the experiment failed. The world, the Torah tells us, was filled with Hamas. There was no respect for the sanctity of other human beings, and that world warranted nothing less than destruction. When the idea was simply that man was somehow divine by virtue of his rulership, the result was calamity. When it was all about dominion and superiority, humankind quickly devolved into the kind of animalistic behavior we were meant to rise above. When the idea is reformulated after the flood, it's in the context of a moral directive. To take a human life is to violate the principle of Tselem Elokim, the Torah tells us. The idea that we're created in God's image doesn't give us rights, it gives us responsibilities. It means that we have to see in every other human being a spark of the divine endowed with infinite potential to create and to contribute. One who dehumanizes another person isn't just guilty of a criminal act. He also undermines his own Tselem Elokim. He dehumanizes himself. When we engaged in racist behavior, it's not just that we commit a wrong against another person. When we engage in racist behavior, we violate the foundational integrity of the divine order. What does our Masorah tell us about racism? It tells us that any form of prejudice is by definition anathema to our fundamental respect for difference. It tells us that racist behavior is a form of heresy, and it tells us that to demean another person is to demean ourselves and to assault the integrity of God's created world in the process. This brings us to the third and final part of my talk tonight as we head down this path. What are the Jewish values that should animate our conversation? What follows is not meant to be an exhaustive catalog, but rather a short list of important principles that I hope will guide us. Many of these conversations are fraught, people are hurt and hurting. There's so many sensitivities and so many potential triggers. Of course, we'll have moderators and facilitators and speakers who are trained and knowledgeable and can help us navigate all of this. But at the outset, I think it's important, again, thinking about the Ramchal's words, just to remind ourselves of 5 values that we take very seriously and I hope will help us achieve some of our most important goals over the course of the coming months. First, one of the most important words that animates these discussions is tzedek, the Torah's sense of justice. So it's worth remembering what the Gemara says about the pasuk, b'tzedek tishbot amisecha. What does it mean that with justice you'll judge your fellow? Gemara says it means havedan es kol es chavercha lekavschus. The first rule of justice is to give people the benefit of the doubt. Someone's guilty, they're guilty. But until that's known, it's our job not just to be non-judgmental, but to start with the working assumption that other people are decent and good. As Bruria famously said to her husband, Rabbi Meir, Yitamu chatayim mina aretz. Miksiv chotim, chatayim ksiv. It's not the sinner that should get us exercised. It's the sin. Number 2. Next principle can be boiled down to one word: questions. From the opening chapters of the Torah, Hashem asks questions. To Adam, he says, Ayeka. To Cain, he says, Ehev alachicha. As Rashi points out, that God knows the answers is immaterial. The idea is that queries promote conversation. Rabbi Sachs, of blessed memory, used to quote Isidore Rabi, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. He was once asked why he became a scientist, and he said, my mother made me a scientist without her ever knowing it. Every other kid would come back from school and a mother would say, oh, tell me something. What'd you learn in school today? My mother used to say, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? Asking good questions, he said, made me into a scientist. To be a good listener, to be able to hear and learn. Let's make the extra effort to make fewer proclamations and fewer pronouncements and ask more questions. Number 3. Third principle to keep in mind is humility. To remember simply that as much as we know, someone else knows something beyond what we know. Whatever our collective experience, someone else has a different experience. I always find Yehuda Mirsky's summary of Rav Kook's political credo to be particularly apt. He writes the following, he says, I should always recognize not only that my opponent is human, but also that he has a piece of the truth that is unavailable to me. He has a piece of the truth that is unavailable to me. These conversations will be successful to the extent we remember how much we need one another. Fourth is empathy. The Gemara in Eruvin tells us that we follow in those machlokos between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, we follow Beis Hillel. Why? Because Beis Hillel would always listen first to the other side. One of life's tallest orders is seeing the world from the perspective of someone else, but that's exactly what we're called on to do. And finally, we should remember that tshuva is always possible. No one is irredeemable. Whatever mistakes someone may have made in their past, we consider it axiomatic that the story is never closed because a person never loses his or her ability to write another chapter. Past is the past. There's no person who can't do better tomorrow. My friends, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin li batel mimenu. Our efforts over the coming months aren't going to cure the plague of racism that ails this nation. But if each of us does our part, we'll all be a little closer to the finish line. And perhaps in the process, we'll bring to our world a little more dignity and a little more humanity. May Hashem bless all of our efforts. May the coming weeks and months be filled with healing and hope. It's a pleasure now to turn things over to our community educator, Ara Weinbach.
Amen. Rabbi Levine, thank you so much. Thank you, Virginia, and thank everyone here for taking the time to join us this evening and launch this year of active listening. I'm next few minutes to just share with you the ways in which you can concretize these values and the mission that Rabbi Levine has just articulated to us. I want to just share with you the flyers and information about our 2 upcoming events and really about our trajectory for the whole year. Our first scheduled event, which will be coming up on November 30th, is called Let's Talk About It, an honest conversation about racism, policing, and the role of faith communities. It will be a conversation between myself and Officer Anthony Campbell, who is the former New Haven police chief and my professor at Divinity School. He's going to share about his life experience growing up as a Black man in Harlem, and how he came to Yale and then Yale Divinity School, became an ordained minister, and then a police officer and rose in the ranks to become a police chief. He's going to share his unique perspective and deep empathy and connectedness with us to help open all these conversations that we hope to deepen over the course of the year of learning and listening together. Our next event will be, there we go. Our next event will be our 2020 Martha Sonnenschein Memorial Lecture with Dr. Rivka Press-Schwartz. That will be on Tuesday, December 22nd. She will be speaking to us about the topic of everything you wanted to know about Orthodox Jews and race, but were afraid to ask. Dr. Rivka Press-Schwartz is a brilliant historian and teacher, and really understands what it means to be an Orthodox Jew thinking about issues of race. So I strongly encourage everyone to attend and register for both of these events. Additionally, this is our trajectory for the year. I've already shared with you our events for November and December. In January, we will have a Black History lecture series teaching us about topics within Black history and also the role of Jews in that. That will be January. And then in February, we will have a conversation between Clint Odom from the National Urban League and our very own Sefi Kogan, who is the global director of AJC Young Leadership and also the host of the People of the Pod podcast. They are close friends and will be talking to us about the issue of racism and anti-Semitism. In March, we will have the opportunity to hear personal narratives, the personal life story of people of color in our neighborhood and in our community. And in April, we will have a Beit Midrash with Alana Stein-Hain, a former Jewish Center community educator and current brilliant Torah teacher. And she will be running a Beit Midrash on the topic of Jews and race. Additionally, throughout the year, we will have youth and family programming and other events that will relate to YoVAL. You will be receiving after this event an email with the opportunity to provide us with feedback, as well as the flyers and the links to register for the events that we just shared with you. We really invite your feedback, and we hope to engage in many meaningful conversations with you throughout this year. As this event is ending, we encourage you to attend. Rabbi Buchler is giving a class right now on the Siddur, on Tefillah, the Amidah. The link will be posted in the Jewish Center WhatsApp. And ultimately, we look forward to listening and learning with you throughout this year together. Thank you. Have a great night, and we hope to see you at future YoVAL events.
Thank you, everyone.